the data from the UN reports and every report and our personal experiences as we get through these weather events, extreme weather events, and watching people suffer is we need really all hands on deck solution to solve the climate crisis. No sector can do it alone. No sector can do it without really coordinating with others, in fact. And one of the areas we don't always talk about a lot is philanthropy. And so today we're going to talk about what the unique role is of what's being called climate philanthropy in helping to solve the climate crisis and really bolstering up maybe the other solutions, maybe taking some of the risk out before private capital can step in. So let's find out from a master who's been doing this work for a long time all over the planet. Welcome to Electric Ladies Podcast. We bring you insights and tips from remarkably innovative women about corporate responsibility, energy, sustainability, and ESG related issues. I'm your host, Joan Michelson. We talk about innovation, leadership, technologies, and careers, always bringing a new perspective. Find us anywhere you like to listen to podcasts on our website, electricladiespodcast.com, and through my Forbes blog as well. And please pass it on to your friends. And if you are so inclined, leave us a 5-star review. It helps other people find us. If you are struggling with your own career, especially in this craziness, and if you want to be in the climate ESG related economy, please reach out to me on Twitter and let me know. We can help you no matter what industry you're in. So as a listener of Electric Ladies Podcast, you're clearly interested in saving the planet and seeing who can do what, like all the steps that can be taken. And one of the areas that we, as I said a minute ago, have not really talked a lot about is leveraging philanthropy. Yes, we talk about nonprofits and we know about grants from the government, et cetera, but climate philanthropy, I suspect, is a bit different. So let's find out more about it and how we can integrate all that we do and the rest of us do around the economy by leveraging climate philanthropy, perhaps, or whether they're leveraging what we do. I'd like you to meet Heather Grady. Heather Grady, Vice President of Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors. She leads the practice area of environment and climate change. Previously, she was Vice President for Foundation Initiatives at the Rockefeller Foundation, overseeing the grant-making budget of about $65 million. So we know she knows her stuff. Prior to that, she was Managing Director of Realizing Rights, great name, the Ethical Globalization Initiative, a decade-long partnership between Columbia University, the Aspen Institute, and the International Council on Human Rights, cool, founded by former Irish Prime Minister Mary Robinson, who is a force herself to be reckoned with. Heather also has taught at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs, and I suspect in many other places. She has a master's degree in public administration from the Kennedy School at Harvard and a BA from Smith College. So welcome to Electric Ladies Podcast, Heather, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Joan. Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be with you today.
Thank you. So let's start by setting the table so we all know what we're talking about here. How do you define climate philanthropy?
I would say it is, so philanthropy generally, we consider contributing private money for public good or community good. And climate philanthropy is simply when we're making those private contributions in ways that are going to address the climate crisis that our country and that the world is facing today. I would expand that slightly by saying that one of the trends that I'm seeing is a real interlinking of climate and nature problems and climate and nature solutions. So I often talk about climate philanthropy now, connecting it a little more with both nature-based solutions for climate change and just, the interrelationship between those two.
Well, I was going to ask you about that actually in a minute. So let's just get clear on what climate philanthropy is first, and the role that it plays. So I can kind of see it as de-risking, if you will. So other private capital can come in maybe afterwards in a project. Is that the case, or is climate philanthropy really working on projects and initiatives on their own without without kind of setting the stage for corporate capital to come in other contexts? And so does that make sense? Are you working on projects in collaboration with companies, or to de-risk them for private capital, or where in the stage of evolution, and what kinds of initiatives are we talking about specifically?
Yes, I would say it really includes both of those and more. So I should first mention that at Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors, we are hosting more than 30 different projects that are focused on climate or climate and nature philanthropy. And there's all kinds of models and approaches. In some cases, it is work where the philanthropy is sort of the wedge or the leading edge of de-risking something or innovating with new ways to do things. And we certainly expect that once there's a proof of concept and things are off the ground, that can then be taken up either by private sector return-seeking capital or indeed by government funding. The government is not necessarily best placed to take risks, and sometimes companies won't either, but philanthropy really has, I think, a commitment to taking risk. But sometimes it's climate philanthropy will include, of course, both adaptation, which is how are we helping people in the world cope with the effects of climate change and successfully adapt to the changing environment we see around us. And it's also about mitigation, which is trying to actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and in other ways reduce the what we are seeing as the growth of climate change impacts. In both of those cases, some funding is going to nonprofit or not-for-profit activities that will probably never be contributed to by the private sector. So that would be just typical charitable work. Sometimes it's things like, it could be anything from getting a public awareness about the problem of climate change and solutions and how we can each play a part. Sometimes it's community-based models of how we can work on addressing climate change in the years to come. Sometimes it's supporting the rights and the voices of Indigenous peoples around the world, who are really the very best stewards of our planet Earth.
You said so sometimes. So do you also invest, if you will, in or donate to for-profit? Well,
for example, sometimes in terms of what's going to work, we might have consulting firms who are generally for profit, but they're doing some work. Let's say they're doing work around analytical modeling, or they are doing work with their clients, and the work that they are doing is charitable, is for charitable purpose. In those cases, sometimes we can invest in for-profits. We can give them charitable contributions, but it always has to be for a charitable purpose. That's good, because what we're doing is we're drawing on we draw on the capacity of nonprofit leaders, we draw on the capacity of community members, on the capacity of government officials sometimes, and sometimes business people. It's just as you said at the beginning, it really needs to be all hands on deck in this enormous challenge that we have.
Yeah, and that's why I was asking, because I was kind of imagining, maybe a bad analogy, but kind of the SBIR grants that the government gives out, Small Business Innovation Research grants. because they're to reduce the risk, the technical and financial risk, so that then private capital can come in. But those are all for profit. Those are all small companies being birthed as for profits. And they are designed, that money is designed to help them get to the next stage, right? So that's kind of how I was picturing this a little bit, because so I appreciate your clarification. To your point about needing all hands on deck, I saw that you've talked and written about the need for cross-sector collaboration. So you kind of talked a little bit about it just now, touched on it, I should say, but give us some examples of that and maybe some projects that you're working on now to help us get a feel for what you're talking about exactly.
Yes. Well, one example, there's a project that we support called the Global Commons Alliance. And that one part of that is called the Science-Based Targets Network. The Science-Based Targets Network is setting what we call science-based targets for nature. And that's a kind of a companion to Science-Based Targets Initiative, which is setting targets for climate, for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. In both of these, the idea is globally, we need to be aware of global targets. So for climate, for example, that's 1.5 degrees. We have to keep temperature rise below 1.5 degrees Celsius. The Science-Based Targets Initiative is a nonprofit program within RPA. And we, through that project, we're trying to set similar targets for what's the target for the world for biodiversity? How do we make sure we protect biodiversity? What is the science-based target to protect the ocean? What about for freshwater use or for land use? So once we've determined the global targets, we then have to say, well, what's the responsibility of an individual company? Because that's really what we need. If we know it's the same thing for the climate target of 1.5 degrees, we have to then say, well, what is an individual company responsible for? So this is a nonprofit program or project, but it has to partner with companies because it's companies who are going to ultimately be responsible for that. So our team is working hand in hand with companies saying, let's pilot. How do we set targets? How do we validate targets? Then how do we start to use them? What is our public commitment? And then who's going to do the monitoring, which probably at the end of the day is going to come back to nonprofit actors who are going to hold those companies accountable. But I think that's a very good example of how, whether you're talking about climate or other aspects of environment and nature, it's a partnership, really. A partnership, though, where we're really putting accountability at the forefront.
Well, I'm glad you said the word accountability because that's kind of what I'm thinking about as well. But just to clarify first, is this so you're not giving money to the companies, you're saying to the companies, we're doing this science-based target initiative and we want to partner with you, have them do their part and you do your part to collaborate on a given project, and then the non-profit side is doing the monitoring, if you will. That's right? Is that right? Okay.
That's right. So we want the independence. This is a coalition of many nonprofits and environmental organizations, several of whom are household words. It's the staff of these NGOs, non-governmental organizations, that are doing the work on the, determining how do we define the science-based targets, how do we set them, and how do we validate them. But again, if we are expecting companies to sign on to them, to embrace them right inside their own companies, and then to report on them, that means we have to be talking to the companies early on. And we're always looking for leaders, because in any endeavor, of course, whether we're talking about social rights or environmental issues, in any endeavor, there are going to be companies who are leaders and companies who are laggards. So I can say generally in all the projects that we host and most of the projects that I see in the nonprofit sector, we are looking for, in the partnership with the private sector, is really with the leaders. That's where the change is going to come from.
Yeah, I'm sure. So where is the accountability? Where does that actually come from? So if you're giving money, say, to a nonprofit, I mean, I can name several that I've interviewed, for example, Women in Africa, Women Climate Centers International, or whatever, some organization. What kind of accountability is Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors demanding, if you will, from its grantees?
That's a great question, and it's a hot topic. So, in general, in philanthropy, it's a challenge because funders, foundations, and private funders, individual philanthropists, and so on, make a grant, often through RPA. We make a grant to a nonprofit organization, and then there are reporting requirements. So the nonprofit and RPA, when we're receiving these funds, we have a high level of accountability to the whichever institution or funder gave us that money. At the same time, we have to follow public regulations. So in the US, there are laws around what counts as charitable contributions. So we're very careful to do the due diligence and make sure that we're complying with US laws. But at the end of the day, we have to be equally accountable to all of those on whose behalf we're serving. So this is very important to us, that any organization that's getting a grant from RPA, and just generally in the nonprofit sector, if we're saying we're trying to help community members, let's say there's climate philanthropy that is going toward regenerative agriculture projects at the community level, or grants that are going to a community to try to protect their land rights against maybe industries that are harming them. We want to make sure that those community members also have a say and a stake in what the organization that has received the funds is doing on their behalf. So accountability, it too easily can be one directional, but we believe in the best case scenario, there's accountability that's really almost, it's holistic. So it's multi-directional, let's put it that way.
That makes perfect sense. And so, in effect, what I'm hearing you say is that the grantees, wherever they are in this virtuous cycle, all have a say, each has a say in what the accountability mechanism is that they have to be responsive to. It's not just put upon them, that they actually have a say in what that system or metric or reporting system is, that they have to comply with. Is that right? Yes.
And the grantee, in turn, we want to make sure that the grantee has good relationships with the communities who they are supporting. So, for example, if we are funding a project that is supporting renewable energy projects, the funder that we work with, and we want to make sure that the grantee is spending the money on what they said they would spend it on. At the same time, we want to make sure that the community is receiving what the grantee has said they would provide. At the same time, it's very interesting because in philanthropy today, there's a debate that goes on about the need for organizations to also have some run room to pivot their strategy when needed. So we don't want the funders to be overly prescriptive in how the grantee spends their money. Because as we see, I mean, what a fast-paced world. If COVID taught us anything, it's that external circumstances can really affect how you plan to spend money. But there are changes every day. You know, there might be government regulations that change. There might be incredible opportunities at the local level. So at the end of the day, it's about partnership. It's about having good relationships between the givers of the money and the receivers of the money. And again, always involving the communities who we're ultimately serving.
Well, that's great. I'm glad you said that. And one of the things that comes to mind as you're saying that is that so many nonprofits struggle with just operating capital. And so often money they get from philanthropies and philanthropists is earmarked so, to a project A or project B or to help X population or Y population, when in fact what they really need is operating capital that they have flexibility to spend how they need to, which includes the pivots that you're talking about they may need to make, right? A lot of companies may have had money that was earmarked for a project, and then, as you say, when COVID hit, they might have just needed it to stay alive, to stay in business, to get through COVID, and they couldn't go do that project in Malaysia or Mozambique or wherever, or Chicago, because of COVID, because everything shut down.
Exactly. And I think funders and investors in businesses understand that there are operating costs that can change over time. I mean, a typical one is IT costs. Mm-hmm. You can invest in IT that makes you much more effective and much more efficient, but there's a cost to it. And we're dismayed when we see that funders say, oh, your overhead's gone too high and you're planning to spend more on IT, or sometimes you're spending too much on training, or you're spending too much on monitoring and evaluation, saying that those are overhead costs that the funder doesn't want to bear. But coming back to the theme of protecting, climate change and protecting our environment, those are all very much a part of an organizational effectiveness and organizational health. So we like to give the benefit of the doubt to grantees once they've demonstrated that they're responsible. And there are, of course, hundreds of thousands of them across the country and across the world. Let's encourage funders not to micromanage them because they know what they're doing.
Yay to that. I'm a big fan of not micromanaging. Give people the rope, people. I mean, hire people that know what they're doing and let them do their job that you hired them to do, no matter what the job is, right?
Exactly.
I'm several questions going through my head, but one of them, you've talked again about this need for systemic collaboration, if you will, the holistic approach and having sectors work together. And a key piece of that, of course, is public policy. And that's been pretty dormant for a while, but the Biden administration and the last Congress, as you well know, passed the Inflation Reduction Act, the Infrastructure Investment Act, and the CHIPS and Science Act. And there's close to $1 trillion in that helps with the climate crisis directly or indirectly. And that can be credits for electric vehicles, or it can be shoring up the infrastructure from climate resilience and some of the adaptation. And also, speaking of climate justice, they have the Justice 40 criteria, where 40% of all the funding has to go to help an underrepresented and underserved community. So talk to me a little bit about what you think of that legislation in terms of supporting addressing the climate challenge and working in this cycle of collaboration and partnership with the other sectors.
Yes, thank you. That was such an important piece of legislation. And I really think for all of us, for our children, for our grandchildren, the timing, it was not a moment too soon. It was so important that we have that. It is in its, assuming it will stay intact and we can take full advantage of it, it will make an enormous difference. It's so good for the economy. There are so many opportunities that are available through that for economic development, including in underserved communities. And it's also about behavioral change. It encourages all of us to think about our role as consumers, to think about our role as users of energy, I think for young people who probably aren't necessarily paying as much attention to what's in legislation, these are very long documents that none of us is reading cover to cover. It's particularly meaningful for them. But coming back to philanthropy, there's a role for philanthropy in how we take advantage of changes that have happened on the public policy level. And here's a couple of examples. There's a lot of money on the table for local communities to use, but the application processes, as is often the case, is not simple. So nonprofits and community groups are going to need help from local organizations to do the applications and to make sure that they have the right financial and organizational management in place, that once you get a grant from that program, you're able to report on it. I was at an event here in the San Francisco Bay Area last week and heard from a great organization called Greenlining, which is working on exactly this, looking at the state of California with a lot of both federal and state money on the table. And they work with low-income communities, and they're doing a lot of work to help train them so that they can take advantage of those public funds. Another example is of where philanthropy can help is that there's a lot of money available for renewable energy, but we don't have enough infrastructure yet. We have to set up, electricity grids and transmission lines and so on. Now, if things happen the way they often do here and around the world, those could be placed in places that are low-income communities, underserved communities who don't have a very strong voice in determining what infrastructure gets set in their neighborhoods. There are ways that philanthropy can help, working with community members to say, we want to have a say if that infrastructure is coming in our community or near our community. These are our requirements. This is what we want to happen. Often people get pitted against each other because they say, the way fossil fuel infrastructure was made in the past harmed particularly low-income communities. We don't want to see the same mistakes repeated with the renewable energy revolution that we're seeing. We can do better this time.
Yeah, I totally agree. But how do those communities know that they have access to these funds to ask for them? I mean, a lot of these people I talked to, I interviewed a woman a few weeks ago, Jackie Patterson, who has an organization that helps people who are so far off the grid that they are lacking running water. I mean, these people, they don't know, short of Jackie's help and her organization, they don't know that there's people that they can ask for help. So how do those communities that might qualify even find out about the potential philanthropic funding that they might benefit from?
Well, that's the conundrum we have. That's again, it's where philanthropic funds really have to work on getting the word out, funding local organizations. And here I would say, if we think back to when the Affordable Care Act was passed, and lots of people didn't know that they were now eligible for health care under the new plan. And if they knew about it, they weren't actually, they couldn't access, they might not have the right computer equipment at home, or it might be in a different language. There were all kinds of barriers. And I think a lot of lessons were learned in the couple of years after that started. And if you recall, there was a whole process that was put in place to have nonprofits doing local outreach with local communities to make sure they knew they could sign up before a certain deadline or before a certain benefit kicked in. We're going to need to do the same thing with the IRA. It's so important. And I think that's, exactly. It's a great wedge for philanthropy funding to use, because otherwise this money will sit on the table. And we have to make sure it doesn't, because we need everyone to benefit from this amazing change that we've got, that we're on the precipice of having.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned the opportunities too, because I talk a lot about it's creating whole new career paths, whole new industries, whole new opportunities for every sector to really benefit, and everyone to really look at, how they want to contribute in a different way in their time and energy and skills. I want to go
Yes.
back. Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to add, I think sometimes climate change, both for supporters of it and those who are still a bit dubious, it gets put in its own silo or its own box, and nothing could be further from the truth. The problem of climate change and the solutions to climate change are very connected with, for example, health. How so? Because of the air we breathe. We don't think about it, but the toxins that are released from fossil fuels, it's pollution in the air. When we talk about greenhouse gas emissions reductions, we're talking about the air that we breathe. It's related to food, regenerative agriculture that is actually storing carbon, not releasing it, is going to be very good for our health, as well as being good to address climate. So I'm hoping that as nonprofits are thinking about outreach to their communities around the Inflation Reduction Act and policy change like that, we can bring in organizations that were traditionally working just on agriculture, just with farmers, or health organizations. There's an amazing opportunity here to connect the dots on different types of sectors of work.
I love that you said that, and I'm smiling in part because that's the whole premise behind Electric Ladies podcast, because I cover every sector of the industry, of the economy, because energy and sustainability and climate affect every sector of the economy.
Absolutely.
Plain and simple. I mean, it's not just the energy sector, and it's not just cars, it's public health, it's the arts, it's academia, it's every type of industry known to man. So thank you for that. I really appreciate you saying that. I want to go back to a point you made in the beginning about this intersection of climate and nature solutions. One of the angles that I've covered a lot, which has really fascinated me, is using nature as infrastructure to mitigate climate change. I mean, I had a consulting client who would use conservation strategies, for example, to help mitigate climate change, or to help a community adapt. And so talk about this. It seems obvious to say climate and nature are connected, but when you talk about the climate and nature solutions, and how we need to protect nature from climate change, it seems to me that seems kind of obvious, except that what I think you're also saying is we need to protect the relationship. It's like people didn't think about bees being an endangered species until we realized what a key role they play in the full ecosystem, right? So talk a little bit about this intersection of nature solutions and biodiversity in the way that we craft solutions to the climate crisis.
Yes. I think the one that's talked about most often is tree planting, because tree planting has so many benefits to our local communities. I mean, I'll just name a few. So planting trees actually cleans the air around us. It provides shade in cities that have more trees in parks. Actually, the ambient temperature of the city goes down rather than cities that are more covered in asphalt. Trees provide a place for migrating birds. There's all kinds of benefits to trees. And at the same time, when we plant trees, we're storing more carbon in the ground. So that's one example. Another example would be peatlands. A lot of people don't think very much about peat, but a lot of the carbon that is stored in the earth is in peatlands that exist in places like Scotland and in the Arctic, and even in Africa, in the Democratic Republic of Congo and other countries. So right now, peat is being dug up and used for a fuel source, but it's not a fuel source we want to use. It's not renewable. It's very, very old. It's been stored there, of course, for thousands of years. So that's another example of where nature and climate really overlap. I was going to mention sometime about this wonderful organization that I've just joined the advisory board of, called Daughters for Earth. And it's made up of women who want to make a contribution, either, that old saying, time, treasure, and talent, one or more of those, to women-led projects around the world. And examples of these where it's good for the environment and it's addressing climate change are things like local mangrove regeneration and expansion projects, community farms in urban areas, forests that are being restored all in the Amazon and in many other places, and then just regenerative agriculture, where we know that agriculture that is sort of monocropping, that's stripping the land and putting nitrogen fertilizer in year by year, that destroys the land over time. Whereas regenerative agriculture, actually planting different types of crops, using integrated pest management, a whole series of approaches, is protecting the climate. Again, at the same time that it's a much more habitable environment for the insects and the birds that we need to continue our existence.
Well, I've interviewed two of the stars, if you will, of Daughters for Earth, Zainab Salbi and Justin Winter. So you might want to catch those interviews. Yeah, they're doing yeoman's work, and Jody
sure
Allen is heroic for helping to kick that off. So I'm thrilled that you're on an advisor to them now. They're doing really terrific work. So I want to ask you a couple things and then get some career advice from you for mid-career women. But these are two really separate issues. Speaking of going, we don't want to go back to the mistakes we made before. We still need the oil companies on some level, right? So what role do you see for the oil and gas companies, for fossil fuel companies?
Well, if we're honest, most of us are still driving around in cars that use petrol, and most of us have gas stoves at home and gas water heaters and so on. So we're still addicted to fossil fuels. I think some companies that are making and countries that are making the majority of their profits, or all of their profits from fossil fuels, some of them understand we need to hit peak oil and go down. Peak oil, we just have to reduce as fast as we can. But for the next several years, the use of fossil fuels has to go down, but it's not going to disappear entirely. I would consider, any fossil fuel company leader who is actually working as fast as they can to reduce their footprint there and increase, those companies still want to exist. We don't want all of their employees to lose their jobs. They need alternatives. So I think it's incumbent upon those companies to really think about the future and turn their own infrastructure not into a stranded asset that will never be able to be used in the future, but how can we really turn those companies into energy companies, but using renewable energy of the future? Some people would say it's impossible. Some business leaders say it's impossible. I don't think it's impossible. I think it's imperative.
I agree with that. Yeah, and I like what you just said. I don't think it's impossible. It's imperative. Absolutely true. And some of them, there've been some stories. I mean, obviously they're increasing their renewable energy sectors, albeit not fast enough and not with enough dollars. But there are also some that are doing more carbon capture. I went to Iceland, and there's some companies that are doing a lot there that now other oil companies are collaborating with. And there's some that are, I think, actually partnering with lithium to get more lithium to create the batteries to pivot that way. And so, yeah, it takes a clever leadership that are willing to manage the transition, right? And really be committed to the transition.
Yes. And as long as companies and their investors and the public tolerates and focus just on short-term profits and quarterly returns, we're not going to win this fight. We have to have a longer-term view of the purpose of business as being about, what some people would call stakeholder capitalism. All of us have a stake in companies doing what's best for our planet and for people of future generations. And it's not just about the stock price today or the returns in this quarter. It's really about a company's long-term future that is so intertwined with our own long-term future.
Exactly. And one of those stakeholders is the planet.
Yes.
So one more question, then I get some career advice from you. Speaking of holding them accountable, what's your take on the ESG reporting systems and the SEC's forthcoming final climate risk disclosure rules? As you know, they proposed them about a little over a year ago, and now they're preparing the final version. What's your take on the ESG reporting systems and on the coming SEC rules, climate rules?
Well, I wish that companies would always do what's best for people and planet. But voluntary standards are not good enough. It really requires regulations that create a level playing field. I mean, right now, what we have is, if there aren't strong enough regulations, then companies that do the best thing, that do what's best, can be at a disadvantage compared to those that don't. So we want a level playing field that brings everything up to the highest common denominator, that is what is best for people's health, for our long-term economic picture, for our environment, and for our children and grandchildren. So I'm hoping, I think the backlash against ESG was, it's an unfortunate distraction, but I certainly hope that everyone that people really get behind it. And I think our government needs to be, really be there.
Good for you. Thank you so much. I agree. And the SEC rules are not going to be voluntary, right? They're going to be mandatory.
Right. Yes.
So we'll see what happens. I think the backlash, and I wrote about this in Forbes, I think the backlash is a sign that they're working. If the ESG reporting wasn't working, there wouldn't be people screaming and yelling about it, right?
Exactly.
So before I let you go, I like to give some career advice to our folks, and that's for mid-career women is where I like to focus, because that's really where the fall off is. And so if you're talking about women who are in mid-career, who have an education, who have experience, maybe 10 to 15 years at least of experience, they know what they're good at. They want to excel in their career. They want to make money, and they want to make a difference. So what advice would you give to them?
Well, I think that now, when women are clear that they do want to make a difference, that they want a job with purpose, that's a good thing to put in your cover letter and express on your CV. There are people who haven't worked on mission-driven organizations or companies yet, but if you've spent time, say doing a lot of volunteer work in your community, or there are issues, whether it's climate or children's rights or whatever it may be in your community, make sure that you're emphasizing that when you're applying for positions. We are really looking in my organization, and I see this increasingly, people are looking for new employees who are values aligned and values aware. It is very important to us, a commitment to inclusion and diversity, a commitment to being collaborative in the workplace, not competitive. I think that we should go for jobs, and we should state it at the outset that who I work for, I care about what my company cares about. And one thing that we've often heard is that one reason why companies are doing the right thing on sustainability and climate, it's even more not so much for what consumers want, because there's a lot of consumers that aren't demanding that yet, but they can get the top talent out of business schools. They can get the top talent out of academia when they are very explicit that they care about sustainability and they care about the climate crisis. They're getting their, more choices for who applies to jobs. And I talk to a lot of young people who won't apply for a job with a company or a nonprofit that isn't explicit about that as a commitment. So I think women should go there.
I think that's great. And that's my audience, right? That's the Electric Ladies on. We all want to, we're focused on that intersection of purpose and skill and talent. And I mean, we spend so much, to me, frankly, it just makes sense. I mean, we spend so much of our lives working,
Yes.
we want it to be integrated with who we are. So thank you so much for what you do every day. Any final thoughts before I let you go?
I think I would just say, I want people to remember, I hope your listeners remember that every little step that we take toward protecting climate and addressing, helping the environment, everything, no matter how small, but if you can do big things as well, it all matters. It all matters.
Well said. Well said. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Heather. I really appreciate it. Heather
You're welcome,
Grady,
Joan.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Heather Grady of Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors. So, what do you think about climate philanthropy? Are you gearing your philanthropy to climate projects? Are you looking for jobs in companies that are aligned with your values? Let us know on Twitter. Post it to me at Joan Michelson and send us any questions there for Heather as well. You may win a complimentary coaching session with me. That would be cool. I've talked to a lot of very cool people through this. And please subscribe to our mailing list to stay abreast of our talented, amazing guests like Heather, our articles and career advice. You can subscribe on our website, electricladiespodcast.com. I'm Joan Michelson. Thank you for joining us. See you next time.